Hello and welcome to the second part of our simple inventory tutorial. In this video, we're going to be setting up our UI, so when the player hits their inventory button, the inventory UI pops up and we'll be able to see what the player has in their inventory. Let's start off by actually making the inventory UI. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to make new UI canvas. Then I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to create an empty in here and I'll call this our inventory menu. This is just an empty, doesn't really have anything in it, but it's underneath our canvas. And then I'm gonna right click on the inventory menu. I'm gonna go to UI, panel, then I'm gonna right click on this, go to create empty. We're gonna call this one player inventory display. And then I'm gonna duplicate that and I'm gonna rename this one external inventory display. Okay, and under player inventory display, I'm gonna right click, go to UI, panel, and we're going to right click on this, go to UI, image. I'm going to call this image ItemSlot. So the hierarchy here is that we have our canvas. This canvas is always going to be on, and it's where our inventory menu lives. You can also have other things inside your canvas, like you can have your pause menu here, you can have your special interact options, all sorts of stuff. You could use this canvas to put all sorts of stuff in. In the canvas, you have your inventory menu, and this is just an empty. Okay, so you have all these things, and by default, they'll all be off, right? And that way on your canvas, you can add the component, it's an FSM. We'll have a inventory open close FSM. And this inventory open close will set whether or not our inventory game object is on or off. Okay, so in here, let's just put a key down for now. Again, whatever input system you're using, whether you're using Unity's input manager or Unity's new input system or some third-party asset, we're just looking for a simple input for a button down. So I'm looking for I. I for inventory will be the button that I'm using to open up this inventory system. So it's going to send a new event. It's going to send next. Okay. So this will be inventory closed. And this will be inventory open. And I'm going to put this in here as well. Okay, and it's going to send back inventory closed. I'm going to drag and drop our inventory menu game object in here. Game object, activate, and we're going to deactivate it, and we do not want it to be recursive. Then I'm going to copy this action and I'm going to put it in the inventory open, except here I'm going to activate it. All right, so let's see how this plays out. If I press play, okay, it opens, I again, and it closes. You can see it activating and deactivating there underneath our canvas. Okay, so looking good. Now, just so we can see what we're working with, I'm gonna activate it while we set it up. And so under the inventory menu, we have our player inventory display, and then we have our external inventory display. So the way you could look at it is actually, if I just delete that, and I take this, if I select it, I'm going to come over here and view 2D, so I have this 2D button selected. And with our player inventory display game object selected, I'm going to put my mouse over here in the editor, hit F to find it, and there it is, so I can zoom out, and I can actually see our canvas over here. So if I select the canvas, you can see the four corners of it. The inventory menu is just an empty game object that has our display in it, and our display has this panel with an item slot in it. Okay, so our player inventory display has this panel in it. Now this panel, if I come over here to our rect transform on our panel, if I select this, and if I hold Alt and Shift and then select this center button, it sets the pivot and position of that panel to the center. Now pivots and position on UI objects on rect transforms is a whole thing. I recommend looking that up on Unity's official documentation, but for now, just trust me that what it's doing is it's just putting this right here in the center, and it's now giving us the option to scale the width and height of it. Okay, so this width I can extend to, let's say, something like 350, and the height will say 200, or maybe 150. So it's about that big, and now if I take this item slot, we're gonna duplicate this a bunch of times so it makes a grid of item slots. So it's each of these little slots is where an item could be occupied. But first, what I want to do is go up to panel. We're going to go down here to add component, and I'm going to do grid layout group. Okay, and with the grid layout group on our panel, it's going to organize all of the items underneath it in a grid. So if I select this item slot, and hit Control D to duplicate it a bunch of times, you can see it gets laid out in a grid. So if I select Panel and I go down here to the grid layout group, I could change the way this grid layout group is organizing the grid. So the main thing I want to adjust here is the cell size. What I'm going to do is change it down to something like 65 by 65, maybe even 50 by 50. Yeah, that looks good. And the spacing, we're going to add like 5 and 5. Okay, so now you can see that this grid is becoming a little more clearly defined. And if you want to change how the grid is distributed, you could use this constraint. So you could change the fixed column count or the fixed row count. So for us, I'm going to say, let's do a fixed column count. And let's say it's like 4. And that way I can adjust the panel to match something like maybe 250. And the height, maybe I change to 165 or maybe just 175. But you could see that the grid is kind of occupying the upper left corner, but we're getting a lot of space here on the right and on the bottom. So you could change the child alignment to middle center. That centers it up a little bit more nicely. And then I can come over here and say the height, maybe we do 185, maybe even just 200. Okay, that looks pretty good. So now that we have our player inventory display, I can select our player inventory display and hit Control D. So now we have 2 of them. So now these 2 are childs of the inventory menu. Now the inventory menu, I can add a component and say horizontal layout group. And a horizontal layout group will make sure that all the children of this are going to be laid out horizontally next to each other. So if I select this and go to the horizontal layout group, I can say the child alignment is middle center. If I go to padding, and I could change spacing out, so there's some space in between them. So we'll say the spacing is like 200, and the padding, you could change it something like this, something to negative 150. Okay, so now they're both aligned in the center of the screen. Now if I shrink and grow the screen, you could see that our UI gets cut off. And you don't want this happening for players that are on different screen resolutions. So what you could do is come over to Canvas, and then in the Canvas scaler, you can change this to scale with screen size. And then instead of matching width or height, you could do expand. And let's change our reference resolution to 1920 by 1080. Okay, things are looking a little smaller now. We can adjust that. So in the player inventory display, so I'm just gonna delete this guy really quick so we can adjust this first one. And we're gonna say that on our panel, the grid layout group, we could change our cell size back to something like 125, 125, that looks good. Okay, and we'll change this to 15 and 15. And then I'll change this panel size to looks like maybe 650, and the height to looks like 500. Okay, now if I take this player inventory display, selecting it, Control D to duplicate it, our inventory menu, can change this spacing, change this back down to 0, 0, just so we're looking at the right thing. Okay, that looks good. So let's say the spacing is 650, and we want to move it to about negative 400. All right, now this player inventory display 1, I'm going to rename it to external inventory display. So now we have the players, which is here on the left, and the external. That means if they're looking at a chest, that's what it's going to be looking into. Okay, now what we want is all of these item slots to be prefabs, because we're going to be adding some logic to this, and as we do the programming, we're going to want that programming to apply to all of them. So I'm just going to go ahead and select all of these and delete it, and then I'm going to come over to our project, and inside of our simple inventory prefabs, I'm going to drag and drop this item slot in here. Okay, so we have our item slot. Now I can select it and duplicate it a bunch of times to fill out our panel. And I'm going to do the same thing with the external inventory display, this panel. I'm going to delete all of these and put our item slot in there. I'm going to duplicate it until it fills out. Now we're looking pretty good. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is make sure that our player inventory display is going to be populating with everything that the player currently has on their inventory FSM inside of their inventory array. And the way we can do that is by selecting our player inventory display. We're going to add a component, an FSM. We're going to call this inventory display. Okay, now an inventory display should be a generic idea that we could apply to this one as well. That way we don't have to copy and paste our FSM over. So we can make this into a template. And the things that are unique to the player inventory versus the external inventory, we can do on separate FSMs. So the first thing that we're going to want to do in our inventory display is use it to populate this with all the items that the player currently has. And we could do that in a generic way so it works with the chest later on. So let's just get this up and running with some logic, and then we'll move things around. The gist of it is that we're going to have this first state. It'll be get inventory. Okay, so this is where we're going to get the inventory to display. So in here, we're going to put a get FSM array. And the game object we want to get the array from, we'll call this object with inventory. Okay, I'm going to right click this, edit variable. We're going to make it an input, just so while we're testing this, what I could do is just drag and drop the player in here. We're going to change this later on, but this is just a simple way to make sure the basics of the inventory display are working. And then we'll add how it gets this object later on. Okay, so we're getting that array, and the FSM is called inventory, right? And the variable name is also called inventory. We're going to make a new variable here. It's going to be an array, also called inventory with the capital I. It's spelled the same, just so we have some consistency in the naming scheme. So we're going to store that value in inventory. We don't want to copy values. Okay, so that should get the inventory from our player. What I'm going to do right now is add a next frame event just for this test. And it's going to be setting to itself. Okay, so it's going to be running every frame. I'm going to make this inventory an output so we could see it over here. I'm going to press play, and I'm going to hit I. And what it's telling us here is that it's saying, can only copy arrays with the same element type. That's because the inventory we're trying to get has game objects, but actually the inventory I made was a float. So we could change that by selecting our inventory, coming down to array type, and changing that to game object. This variable is used. Are you sure you want to change that? Yes. Okay. So now I'm just going to make sure I select it again over here. Okay. Now let's press play. So if I press I, it opens up, and you can see that I have nothing in there, right? But as I come over to these cubes to add them, I click this, and you can see that now the inventory in our inventory display has our grass, it has our dirt now, and it has our stone. Okay, so it's successfully pulling the inventory from the player. So now that it has that from the player, I'm just going to get rid of this. We don't need that anymore. Now that it has the inventory from the player, we want it to display in all these item slots. So what we could do is add a little finish transition, send off to the next state. And this state, we're going to be doing a get next. It's going to array get next. We're going to be getting the next inventory item. Loop event, new event called loop event. Add that. And then a finished event called complete. Add that. And then we're going to make a reset flag. We'll call this reset flag underscore inventory. And then the result that we're storing from this array get next will be next item. Okay, and I'm just going to move complete up. You can move your transitions by selecting them and then holding Control and using up and down on the arrow keys. Okay, so complete is going to fire over here. We'll send that off in a sec. And then loop is going to come down here. I'm going to rename this state get next item. And then this state is going to have next child. And the game object we want to get from, we're going to make a new variable for this. We're going to call this ItemSlots. Okay, and I'm going to right click, edit variable, and we'll make it an input variable. Okay, that way what I could do is come over here to our panel with all of our item slots in it, and I could just drag and drop the panel into our item slots. Okay, so in fact, I'm going to call this panel item slots panel, just so we remember. Okay, I'm going to minimize that, come back to our display. Now in here, it's going to be iterating through our item slots, so we're going to store the next one in a new variable called next item slot. Okay, we're going to add a loop event here as well, and a complete event there as well. And the reset flag, we're going to make a new one called reset flag underscore item slot. Okay, moving complete up here. We'll send it this way for a sec, and then loop is going to continue down this way. I'm going to call this state get next item slot. So now that we've got the first item from the inventory and the first item slot from the array of item slots, we want to set that first item in that first item slot. So what we could do is set FSM game object, and we're going to set the item slots value for the object that we're adding to it. So what we're going to need to do is come over to our item slot prefab. I'm going to go inside of it here, and we're going to add an FSM. Okay, we're going to call this item slot. And in this item slot, we're going to have a new variable. It's going to be a game object, and we're going to call it item obj. Okay, so this is the item object. Then we're going to make a new event. We're going to call it ItemSlot space populate. And that's going to be a global event. I'm going to come over here, right click, add global transition, ItemSlot populate. Okay, we'll just call this first one init. And in populate. And in ItemSlot populate, what we're going to do is get FSM object. So get FSM object is how we're going to get the sprite value from our prefab. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just put our project panel right here on the side, and in the game object I'm going to specify, I'm going to drag and drop one of these items we have. So I'll take our grass and put it in here. I'm only doing this right now just so we can get the FSM information for free with these little ... buttons. Okay, so for this we have item, and for variable name we have item sprite. Okay, now what I could do is change this to a variable, and it's going to be our item obj. Okay, so what it's getting from our item obj is the item sprite from it. Now I'm going to copy this text, and we're going to come over to our variables. We're going to make a new object variable. I'm going to paste this name in, item sprite, and the type of object it is. If I come in here and go to Unity Engine, I just hit U a couple times and it brings me over here. And then with my cursor on this side now, if I hit S until I come over to sprite, now we could store that value as an item sprite. So we're getting the item sprite from the item that should be added in here. And then we're going to do a UI set image sprite. Okay, UI image set sprite. It's using owner because we have this image component up here, and the source image for it, this sprite value, is going to be set with our item sprite. So this basic setup should give us the function of populating our inventory UI. Okay, so I'm going to save this. Just got to remember it's item with a capital I. I'm coming back out here, minimize this, and in our inventory display, down here in state 4, the set FSM game object, we can set, oh, and this is a mistake. This is not meant to be item slots. It's supposed to be next item slot. Okay, I'm just going to hide our project really quick. Okay, so the next item slot, what I could do is to get that FSM and variable name for free again, I can just remove that for a second and then drag and drop this in here. So I can get our item slot and our item obj, and we could set that value with next item. Okay, then we could change this back to next item slot. Cool. So after it does that, I'm just gonna add a finish transition, and it should just send back up to the top up here to the get next item. And actually, lastly, what we need to do is send that event. So I'm gonna put the send event here down in this last state. So we'll call this the populate item slot state. And we're going to be sending to the game object FSM. Okay, I'm just going to get some of this information, right? We called it item slot, and we're going to be sending that populate event. Okay, so this should be our next item slot variable. Okay, so it sends that event. Okay, and just before we test this though, what I do want to do is let's make a new state and set this as our start state. Call this init, and we're going to just set some bool values. We're going to want to set our reset flag. So we're going to set our reset flag inventory to true. I'm going to copy and paste this. We're also going to be setting our item slot reset flag to true. Okay. That way, whenever this opens up, when it goes through these array get next and get next child actions, it'll be starting from the top every time instead of picking up where it last left off. Okay. That's what these reset flags are for. Okay. You set them to true. All right. Let's hit play. All right, so if I open the inventory, there's nothing in it. But if I come over here and grab this green one, nothing. Why is that? So it seems the logic should check out. So if we stop it here, and we see that down here, we did get here, right? It has a little 1. Let me just press pause. our populate item slot, it has a little 1 right here, which means that we did get to the populate item slot. So it should have sent the event to this item slot. So if I click on this, it highlights it up here. So I'm going to select it. But you'll see that it didn't send the event, or at least it sent the event, but the item slot never received the event. Now it's likely that what needs to happen is all these items need to be activated in time to receive that event. So what we could try is, if we come over to our player inventory display on init, if we just put in a little wait action, this will tell us if the initialization part is actually what's wrong here. So we'll wait 1 second before it actually finishes. Now, if this works, that means that these item slots just needed time to activate before populating, before receiving that event. So if I open it, nothing, right? But if I grab that and then I open it, you'll see that after the wait happened, it did actually populate this time. So what that tells us is that what we could do, instead of sending that event for every single item slot, we could just take this send event and put it here at the very end when the whole thing is finished. So here is send populate event to all. Okay. Instead of specifying which item slot, you could change this to broadcast all, or even game object and send event to children. Okay, so let's come up here, change this transition to something like 0.1, and this send event will just happen at the end. So we go through this telling every item slot what their item is, but only once all of them have that information do we actually send the event to every single one of them at once. Okay, so let's try that out. Let's hit play, and if I open up my inventory, there's nothing, right? And you can see that we get down here to the final state very quickly now. We don't have to wait that full second. Okay, nothing happens. And if I add this and then hit I, we have that. Add our dirt, hit I, we have it now, stone, and we have it now as well. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. We can now at least display all of our items. Okay, so that's how we can get our inventory UI to display all of the items in the inventory of another thing. So in the next video, we're going to learn how we can move those things around in the inventory. Be sure to check out our other videos to learn all the various features of Playmaker. Links to more learning resources are in the description.